In the town of Dry Creek, cruelty didn't always carry a gun. Most days, it wore a smile and tipped a hat while cutting deeper than any knife. And when the townsfolk turned their malice toward Eliza May, they found endless ways to twist the blade. She had once been promised, a farmer's bride, full of hope, her dowry a quilt chest and hands skilled in baking bread. But hope had soured the day the doctor spoke the word barren in the presence of men who carried it out like gossip in a whiskey flask. By evening, the saloon was echoing with jeers, empty bride. A woman without seed. And by dawn, the whole town had remade her story. It wasn't enough for them to turn their backs. They wanted her to feel it. When she walked to the mercantile, whispers followed like burrs clinging to a skirt. When children played in the street, they hissed, infertile, with the same glee they used to chase stray dogs. Her cheeks burned until she no longer lifted her face. So when Sheriff Darden joked about finding her a husband, the crowd leaned in like cattle scenting blood. Send her to Carver, he drawled, a smirk tugging his lips. The soldier hermit. The widower with dust for company. A fitting pair, his home's as empty as her womb. The laughter rolled hard, glasses clinking, boots stomping. And from that hour, it was decided, they would send Eliza May as a bride to Jack Carver, not as kindness, but as jest. The day came hot, with cicadas buzzing loud enough to drown thought. They dressed her in a second-hand gown, veil crooked, lace yellowing at the seams. A child tossed flour at her hair, shrieking that it was to make her look more bridely. Men slapped each other's backs, women covered their mouths with shawls to hide laughter, though their eyes glittered with spite. Eliza did not cry. She kept her gaze fixed on her shoes, the leather cracked and worn. Inside her palm she clutched a bent brass ring, the one her first fiancé had hurled back when he learned the doctor's verdict. She had kept it, not out of love, but because shame is heavy, and sometimes it's easier to carry the weight you know than to drop it into emptiness. The ring dug into her skin now, a reminder of all the names she had been forced to answer to. The wagon rattled as it carried her through the desert outskirts, laughter fading behind but echoing in her chest. Ahead, the land stretched bare and unforgiving. Jack Carver's ranch waited at its edge, a lone house with weathered boards and a silence that hung over it like a shroud. As the wheels jolted over stones, Eliza pressed the bent ring tighter into her hand and wondered if perhaps she was being delivered not to a husband, but to a grave. But the desert has its own ways of rewriting stories, and sometimes even the cruelest jest can become the seed of something no one dares imagine. Jack Carver heard the wagon before dust rose on the horizon, the wooden wheels complaining, mule harness jingling, voices thin as tin against the wind. He stood on his porch with a hammer in one hand and a nail clenched between his teeth, a tall, broad man baked brown by years of sun and work. The house behind him was a spare thing, a one room with a sleeping alcove, a lean-to kitchen, and a porch that remembered happier carpenters. A second chair by the door sat empty and had for years. The wagon rattled into his yard and coughed to a stop. The driver flicked his reins, didn't bother climbing down. Delivery, he said, jerking his chin toward the veiled woman in the back. Even his grin looked mean. From Dry Creek, with the town's best wishes. He laughed at his own joke, turned the mule, and left a tail of dust for a farewell. Silence fell hard. The woman climbed out slow, careful of her hem, and stood with her hands gathered tight at her waist like she was keeping herself from spilling. The veil didn't hide the color in her cheeks, shame flushed bright, then drained to white. She looked small against the desert, yet somehow stubborn, like those weed flowers that claw up through adobe after one good rain. The faintest tremor moved her shoulders. She kept her gaze down. Jack eased the nail from his teeth and set the hammer on the railing. He had seen pranks delivered by men who called themselves neighbors. He had also buried a bride of his own, under cottonwoods where the creek once ran fat. Grief had taught him to speak only when words had work to do. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eliza May," she said, not lifting her eyes. Her voice had a whiskey-quiet rasp, the sound of someone who'd learned to talk with her teeth clenched. "Jack Carver," he answered, like a handshake given with breath instead of hands. He glanced at the horizon where the wagon had gone, then back at her. The wind pushed a grit whisper along the yard, a hawk cried somewhere high. "You hungry?" A small, startled nod. She swayed as if the question itself had loosened her knees. He stepped inside, left the door open. The open door wasn't welcome, not exactly, it was the absence of a shut one. She crossed the threshold slow, like a deer expecting the snare. The room smelled of leather and ash and boiled coffee. A cradle, unfinished, rested in a corner, dust grey on its rails. Eliza's gaze caught there and flinched away as if she'd touched a hot stove. He ladled beans from the pot into a tin bowl, slid it toward her with a spoon. She sat on the bench, hands shaking just enough to clink metal on metal. He noticed and pretended not to. He ate standing, back to the counter, eyes on the doorway, the way soldiers do when there's only one exit and too much memory. When the bowl was empty, he took it without comment and set it in the washpan. Spare rooms through there. He nodded toward a narrow door. Bed's clean. Window sticks unless you lift on the right. She rose and then paused, fingers curling and uncurling at her skirt. From the pocket she drew a bent brass ring, small, ugly, stubborn. She didn't set it anywhere. She just looked at it, then tucked it back like she'd put away a knife. "Town sent a letter?" she asked, quiet, testing for the edge of mockery. Jack shook his head once. "Town don't write me." He spoke again only at the threshold of the spare room. "We speak plain, here. Work you can do, you do. Work you can't, you don't. Nobody gets mocked for trying." Something in her loosened at that, so slight he might have imagined it. She slipped inside and shut the door soft. Through the boards he heard the smallest sound, a breath held too long and let go. Jack went back to the porch. The sun sank copper behind the mesas. He set his hammer down and took off his hat, turning it in his hands. He didn't bring strays in. He didn't take jokes from Dry Creek. But he knew the look of a creature driven and cornered. He knew, too, that a house starved long enough starts to forget the shape of another heartbeat. Inside the spare room, Eliza touched the window sash, lifted right, and let in a thread of evening wind. She pressed the bent ring to the sill and left it there, in near the air, not yet in the fire. Outside, the hawk circled lower, and the first star pricked the sky like a nail through dark cloth. The cabin's walls were close, but not cruel. They carried the smell of wood smoke, leather oil, and years of sweat pressed into the grain. Eliza sat on the narrow cot in the spare room, her bundle of clothes folded at her feet. The window stuck as Jack had warned. She lifted right, pushed, and felt a thread of cold air cut across her face. Outside, coyotes called from the ridges, voices like cracked bells. For a long time, she didn't move. She kept her hand pressed to the bent brass ring on the sill. The ring was heavy not for its metal, but for the stories welded into it, the fiancé who threw it, the women who whispered about it, the men who spat when she passed. It was not gold, not silver, just brass, bent, ugly. And yet she carried it, because throwing it away meant admitting there was nothing left of her worth. From beyond the thin wall came the scrape of chair legs, the soft groan of timber beneath Jack's weight. No talking, no laughter, no demand. Only the sound of someone alive in the next room. For years she had been alone with silence that cut. This silence felt different. It wasn't sharp. It was heavy, steady, like the hush of a church where no one's watching. The days shaped themselves around that silence. At dawn, Jack rose without waking her, boots thudding softly as he stepped into the yard. She watched from the window once, him walking the fence line, every movement deliberate, the kind of rhythm a man keeps when he's worked too long alone. By mid-morning, she joined him without asking. She carried buckets, fetched tools, her skirts gathering dust until the hems turned the same color as the desert. Jack did not praise, did not scold. He only gave instructions as simple as a knife's edge: hold it steady. Tighten here. That calf's too weak, don't push it. His words came few, but each one landed with weight, and she carried them like stones in her apron pocket. At night, they shared the same room though it felt like two countries divided by a river of firelight. He sat by the hearth, pipe unlit between his teeth, eyes lost in coals. She mended her dress, fingers pricked by needle. Sometimes she caught him glance over, not long, just enough to mark her presence. Sometimes she almost asked what he saw, but the question stuck behind her teeth. Once, when she fumbled with the bucket rope at the well, he reached to guide her hands. His fingers brushed hers, rough skin meeting softer, and she felt a jolt as if the desert wind itself had caught hold of her. He didn't linger, didn't look at her. He simply showed her the knot and stepped back. But that night, lying in the spare room, she touched her palm where his hand had been. It was a house filled with unfinished things, the cradle in the corner, the quilt folded too carefully, a silence that longed for words. Eliza realized that she too was unfinished. Maybe that was why she had been sent here, to be another half-built thing left in the dust. And yet, when she listened to the fire crackle through the wall, she found herself breathing easier than she had in years. The town's laughter was far away. The house did not laugh at her. The land had no patience for shame. It demanded work, and work alone. By the second week, Eliza found herself bound to its rhythm, mornings that began with frost brittle on the sagebrush, afternoons that seared the skin, nights where the stars glared so bright they felt like a judgment. Jack never told her to follow him, but she did. Out by the corral, she learned to carry feed buckets that bruised her palms. In the garden plot, she pulled weeds until her back screamed. She trailed behind him to the well, where he lowered the rope with arms that had known war and ranching both. Each time she asked for a task, he gave it without fuss, plain, like he was handing her a piece of sky. Their words were few. That post won't hold. Step wider when you carry. Careful. That mule bites. He never barked. Never mocked. Each phrase was flint striking stone, small sparks in a life that had once been only shadow. At night, they returned to silence. Eliza stitched the hem of her ragged dress by lamplight while Jack cleaned his rifle or carved shavings from a block of mesquite. They were two people orbiting the same fire, never touching, yet not turning away. The silence between them was no longer emptiness, it was a waiting space, thick with things unsaid. Still, there was distance. She felt it most at meals, when he served himself first, as if keeping the line between host and stranger. Or when he shut the door to his room, leaving her with the creak of boards and her bent brass ring staring back from the windowsill. The ring grew heavier by the day. She often rolled it in her fingers at night, staring at its ugly dent where it had hit the dirt years ago. She hated it, yet could not throw it away. It was proof of the cruel story the town had written for her, barren, unwanted, laughed at. Letting it go felt like letting their voices win. One morning, the mule tangled itself in the rope and brayed loud enough to wake the whole desert. Eliza rushed in with a kitchen knife, sawing frantically at the knot while Jack steadied the animal's head. The rope cut her hand, blood seeping along her palm, but she didn't stop. Finally the knot gave, the mule staggered free, and Eliza collapsed back into the dirt, panting. Jack looked at her for a long while. "You're stubborn," he said. She lifted her chin, breath ragged. "I've had to be." Something passed between them then, raw and wordless. He didn't thank her. She didn't ask for it. But his eyes lingered longer than before, and her chest ached with the strange relief of being seen not as broken, but as capable. That night, she set the brass ring not by her bed but on the shelf near the hearth, where the firelight could touch it. She didn't know why, only that hiding it under her pillow no longer seemed right. The distance remained, but it had shifted. Now it felt less like a canyon carved by cruelty, and more like a river waiting for a bridge. The desert had a way of drawing blood from anyone who stayed long enough. One evening, Jack came in from the corral, shirt sleeve torn, crimson staining the fabric. He tried to move past it as though nothing was wrong, but Eliza saw the way his jaw clenched, how his arm hung stiff at his side. "You're hurt," she said, rising from the table. "Not worth mentioning a dot." His voice was flat, a man accustomed to dismissing pain. But she stepped forward anyway. "Sit." He hesitated, as though no one had spoken to him that way in years. Her eyes did not waver. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the bench. The lamplight caught the gash, a long, angry line carved by barbed wire. Eliza fetched water and tore a strip from the hem of her dress. The sound of ripping cloth echoed in the small room, sharp and startling. She dipped the rag in water, knelt beside him, and pressed it against his skin. He hissed through his teeth, but didn't pull away. Hold still, she murmured. Her hands trembled, though not from fear. They trembled because for the first time in months, her hands were allowed to tend, to care, to belong to something other than shame. Jack studied her face in the flicker of firelight. Her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips pressed tight, her fingers steady despite the tremor. She smelled faintly of soap and dust, the scent of someone who worked hard and carried no perfume but her own survival. "Your scar," she whispered, dabbing carefully. He gave a short laugh, humorless. "Already carry enough of those." She met his eyes, startled. In that moment, she saw past the hard planes of his face to the soldier beneath, the boy who had once ridden into war and returned with wounds no one wanted to name. Her breath caught. "Scars mean you lived." He looked at her then, truly looked, as if her words had touched something he had buried deep. For a heartbeat, the silence between them hummed like a taut string, fragile but resonant. She wrapped the cloth tight around his arm, her fingers brushing the warmth of his skin. He didn't flinch. Instead, he said, voice low and almost grudging, "You've got steadier hands than most." It was not a compliment dressed in sweetness. It was plain truth, spoken the way Jack Carver spoke everything. And yet, to Eliza, it was more precious than any praise she had ever been given. She sat back, cloth-stained, knees aching from the floor. The fire crackled, the desert wind moaned against the shutters, and for the first time since arriving at this place, she felt something ease inside her chest. Not love, no, that was too far away. But a crack, a fault line in the silence, where something might grow. Later, when Jack had gone to his room, she picked up the bent brass ring from the shelf. She turned it over in her hand, the firelight glinting on its dented surface. For years it had been proof of her emptiness. But tonight, she set it back down and noticed, for the first time, that it no longer burned her fingers to touch it. The sky warned them before the storm broke. Black clouds stacked high above the mesas, thunder rumbling like artillery deep underground. By mid-afternoon, wind whipped sand across the yard, stinging skin, and driving cattle into panic. Jack tightened the corral gate, shoulders hunched against the gusts. Eliza ran to his side without waiting for instruction, skirts snapping like sails around her legs. "Get inside," he shouted over the roar. She shook her head, clutching the gate with both hands. "I won't leave you out here alone." The words startled them both, fierce and unyielding. Jack's eyes flickered, but there was no time for argument. Together they fought the animals into shelter, rope cutting Eliza's palms raw as she pulled against terrified hooves. Rain slammed down in sheets, soaking them to the bone, drowning every sound but the thunder's crash. A steer bucked hard, nearly toppling Jack. Eliza threw her weight against the gate, shoving it shut with a cry that ripped from her throat. The latch clanged into place. For a moment, they stood there, heaving, drenched, eyes wide in the lightning's flash. Jack seized her wrist, not in anger, but like a man catching something he could not afford to lose. He pulled her through the torrent, across the yard, into the cabin's thin light. Inside, they collapsed by the hearth, water running from their clothes to pool on the floorboards. Eliza's teeth chattered, her body shivering so hard her breath came in gasps. Jack shrugged off his sodden coat and draped it across her shoulders. The weight of it was heavy, the warmth faint but growing. For a long moment they simply sat, close enough that she felt the heat rising from his body. The storm battered the cabin walls, rattling windows, and howling through the chimney, but inside there was a different quiet, a hush that carried something more fragile than silence. Eliza's hair clung wet to her cheek. Jack reached, almost without thought, and brushed it back. His hand lingered just a breath longer than necessary. Their eyes met. No words, no promises. Just two weary souls staring across the small distance that had kept them apart for weeks. Eliza's lips parted, not to speak, but in the tremble of someone who wanted to believe she belonged. Jack's jaw clenched, then eased, as if he too wanted to close that distance and didn't know how. The fire popped, sparks jumping into the air between them. Both flinched slightly, as if reminded of the fragile boundary they weren't ready to cross. Eliza pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. Jack leaned back, pipe forgotten on the table. Neither spoke again until the storm began to break, rain softening, thunder rolling farther away. Yet when Eliza went to her narrow cot that night, her chest still shook, not from cold, but from the warmth that had brushed her skin for the briefest, impossible instant. And when Jack closed his door, he stood a long while with his hand pressed to the wood, wondering when the silence of his house had started to feel less like safety and more like prison. The land was quieter after the storm, but the desert rarely gave peace for long. One afternoon, near dusk, a sound drifted across the canyon flats, a thin, desperate bawl that rose and fell with the wind. Jack paused mid-stride at the fence, his head turning sharp as a hawk's. Eliza followed his gaze toward the canyon's dark seam. "Calf," he muttered. Slipped the fence. He grabbed a coil of rope, his movements clipped and certain. Eliza's stomach nodded, but her feet carried her after him without thought. The path into the canyon wound narrow between red walls, their shadows swallowing daylight whole. The cry grew louder, pitiful and sharp, until they saw it, her young calf wedged between rocks, its leg twisted, eyes rolling white with panic. Above, on the ridge, dark shapes slunk, coyotes, pacing, waiting for weakness. Jack dropped to his knees, rope ready, boots sliding on the damp moss where runoff still clung. The calf thrashed at his touch, nearly throwing him sideways. Eliza rushed forward, skirts catching on thorn and stone. "I can hold it," she called. "Stay back," he barked, but she shook her head, eyes fierce. Without waiting, she crouched at the calf's head, her hands firm on its muzzle. She whispered soft nonsense, "It just sounds, a song without words." The animal stilled, trembling, but no longer wild. Jack worked the rope, prying the trapped leg free. The rock tore at his knuckles, blood mixing with dust, but at last the limb came loose. Together they heaved, pulling the calf upright. It stumbled, nearly falling again, but Eliza held steady, her body a brace stronger than her frame should allow. A coyote yipped from the ridge. Jack raised his rifle, fired once into the air. The crack thundered through the canyon, sending shadows scattering like leaves. When the danger passed, Jack leaned back against the wall, chest heaving. Eliza stood near him, hair loose, face flushed, her arms still steady around the calf's neck. In the dim light, she did not look small or shamed. She looked fierce, alive, carved by the land into something the town had never imagined her to be. "You're tougher than they'll ever know," Jack said, his voice rough but quiet. Eliza's breath hitched, though she tried to hide it. She had waited years for someone to say she was anything but broken. They led the calf out together, Jack steadying its steps, Eliza guiding it by gentle pressure of her hands. Back at the corral, the mother cow lowed, circling her calf, nudging it with a rough tongue. The sight of reunion pulled at Eliza's chest until tears stung her eyes. That night, she sat long by the hearth while Jack cleaned his rifle. She held the bent brass ring in her palm and thought of the canyon, the coyotes, the way Jack had looked at her. The ring still felt heavy, but something inside her had shifted. Maybe, she thought, it was not proof of her emptiness after all, but a weight she could one day set down. Jack glanced at her across the fire, and though no words passed, his eyes held a truth plain as daylight. He no longer saw her as the town's jerk. He saw her as someone who had stood beside him when the desert tested its teeth. Spring came sudden and wild, snowmelt rushing down from the high ridges until the dry riverbeds swelled into torrents. Jack and Eliza were out riding fence when the roar of water reached them, thunderous, restless, carrying branches like matchsticks. Then, cutting through the noise, came a sound thinner, sharper. A cry. They reined hard toward the bank. Below, clinging to a half-sunk log, a boy no older than 5 fought the current. His small arms thrashed, his face pale with terror. The river clawed at him, ready to drag him under. Jack swung from his saddle before the thought had time to root. He stripped his coat, tossed it aside, and waded in, current ripping at his legs. The boy's cry broke into choking silence as the water closed over his head. Jack lunged forward, grabbing him just as the torrent tried to claim him. "Rope!" Jack bellowed, voice ragged. Eliza was already moving. She tore the coil from her saddle, the same rope that had once symbolized her shame, and anchored it around her waist. She dug her heels into mud, knuckles white as she fed the line out into the water. Jack caught it one-handed, the boy locked against his chest with the other. The current tore at them both, threatening to wrench them apart. "Hold, Eliza," he shouted. Her back screamed, palms burning, but she braced and pulled. Inch by inch, the river yielded, surrendering its prize. Jack stumbled onto the bank, drenched and gasping, boy clinging limp to his shirt. Eliza dropped to her knees, hauling the child into her arms. She wrapped him in her shawl, rocking him close, whispering words she hadn't spoken since girlhood, in nonsense lullabies, tender as breath. The boy coughed, spat river water, then clung to her with a sob that split her chest wide. Jack leaned heavy on his knees, chest heaving, eyes locked on the sight before him. Eliza May, a barren bride, cast-off joke, holding life against her heart as if she had been born for it. The boy's name was Thomas, they learned once his sobs ebbed. His family's wagon had been swept away upriver. No parents, no kin, nothing left but the small body shivering against Eliza's breast. Back at the cabin, she sat by the fire with Thomas nestled close, feeding him spoonfuls of broth, stroking his damp hair. He did not let go, even in sleep. Jack stood in the doorway, watching in silence. The weight of what he saw pressed heavy in his chest, heavier than any rifle or rope he had ever carried. For Eliza, something broke open that night, in not the old breaking of shame, but the kind that makes room. She felt Thomas's heartbeat against her own, fragile and fierce, and the brass ring in her pocket no longer burned. It lay quiet, almost forgotten, as though a new story had already begun to overwrite the old. When Jack finally spoke, his voice was low, certain. "He stays here. With us." And in that moment, for the first time since she had been cast out, Eliza May felt herself named not as barren, not as broken, but as mother. Word of the flood and the orphan traveled faster than any rider. By the week's end, Dry Creek buzzed with it. The barren bride has a child now. Jack Carver claims him as son. Some laughed in disbelief, some sneered that it wouldn't last, but under every whisper lay a crack of unease. The story they had written for Eliza May was shifting, and the town didn't like when stories slipped free. Jack knew they would need supplies sooner or later. He hitched the wagon, loaded a list scrawled in his hand, and said, "Best we go together." Eliza's stomach nodded at the thought of stepping back into Dry Creek. Her last memory there was jeers, flour thrown in her hair, children chanting her name like a curse. Yet she glanced at Thomas, curled against her shawl, and knew she could not stay hidden. If she was to claim this life, she had to face the ones who tried to take it. They rode into town at sundown, when shadows stretched long and the saloon spilled laughter into the street. Heads turned as hooves clopped across the boards. Jack sat tall, unreadable as ever. Eliza sat beside him, Thomas in her lap, his small hands gripping her shawl. The murmur began immediately. Men at the hitching post spat tobacco into the dust. Women in aprons whispered behind gloved hands. Children pointed, eyes wide. The words barren and bride hissed in the air, followed by laughter sharp as glass. Sheriff Darden leaned on the saloon rail, smirk broad across his jowls. "Well, well. Look who comes struttin' up back. Thought you'd be hiding under that cowboy's porch forever, girl." His eyes flicked to the boy in Eliza's lap. "And what's this? A miracle from the desert?" Laughter rolled across the street, cruel and eager. Eliza felt the old heat burn her cheeks, the bent brass ring in her pocket searing against her palm. She nearly dropped her gaze, until Thomas turned, tugged at her shawl, and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "Ma, are we going home after this?" The word cut through the street like a shot. "Ma. Not barren. Not broken. Just Ma." The laughter faltered. Some faces turned away. The cruelty that once fed them tasted bitter now, heavy in their throats. Jack let the silence stretch until the town had to hear it. Then, with calm steady as river stone, he laid his hand over Eliza's on the reins. "You got your answer," he said to the sheriff, voice low but carrying. "More than your mockery ever gave." He clicked the reins, and the wagon rolled forward. The sheriff spat into the dust, but no one laughed. Not this time. As they left Dry Creek behind, the evening sun cast their shadows long across the hardpan, three figures, bound not by shame but by choice. Eliza pressed the bent ring in her pocket, and for the first time it didn't feel like a chain. It felt like something waiting for its end. Back at the ranch, the air was different. The cattle lowed in the twilight, ghosts stamped her pale hooves in the corral, and the cottonwoods whispered dry songs. But in Eliza's chest, something deeper stirred, a quiet that felt less like shame and more like belonging. Thomas slept on the cot that night, curled small beneath a quilt Eliza had stitched back together from scraps. His soft breaths filled the room with a rhythm she had never thought to hear in her lifetime. She sat by the fire, brass ring heavy in her hand, the bent circle glinting in the flames. Jack came in from the porch, boots leaving dust prints across the floorboards. He paused at the side of her, ring clutched in her fist. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of mesquite wood burning low. At last, Eliza whispered, "This ring's been a noose around my neck. Proof I was nothing but a joke to them." Her voice trembled, but she lifted her eyes to his. "If I keep it, I keep their story. And I can't do that anymore." Jack studied her in the firelight, the scar on his forearm catching a red gleam. Slowly, he stepped closer, kneeling beside her chair. "Then burn it," he said simply. Her breath caught. "You'd have me let it go?" "I'd have you free." His voice was steady, carrying the weight of every silence they had shared. Eliza turned the ring once more between her fingers. She thought of the day it had been hurled into the dirt, of the laughter that had followed, of nights when she pressed it to her chest because it was all she had left. She thought, too, of Thomas calling her Ma, of Jack's hand closing steady over hers in town, of the garden where green shoots had forced their way through desert soil. With a trembling breath, she held the ring over the fire. The brass heated, catching sparks. For a moment she faltered, but then Jack laid his hand lightly on hers, steadying her. Together, they let it drop. The ring hissed as it hit the coals, metal warping, blackening. It did not scream, did not curse. It simply melted into ash, as fragile as the story it once carried. Eliza felt her chest lighten, as if the desert itself had lifted a stone from her ribs. She leaned back, tears hot on her cheeks, but they were not tears of shame. Jack watched the fire, his hands still resting over hers. "Some things ain't meant to last," he murmured. "But sometimes what's left is stronger." Eliza turned, meeting his gaze. He did not kiss her, did not rush the moment. Instead, he reached up, brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, and let his hand linger there, rough and warm. She leaned into it, closing her eyes. Behind them, Thomas stirred in his sleep and murmured again, "Ma." The fire crackled, the desert wind softened, and for the first time, Eliza felt the future open like a door left wide. Not grand triumph, not glory. Just the quiet proof of love, a scar tended, a child held, a ring burned to ash. And if you ask the desert what keeps a heart alive in its barren miles, it will not say gold or laughter. It will whisper what Eliza May learned that night, a kiss unspoken, a scar remembered, and one hand that never lets go.